Eala takes selfie with fans. She slipped on the most famous patch of grass in tennis, right in front of a global audience. And for one suspended half-second, nobody in that stadium knew whether they were about to witness a highlight reel or a heartbreak. And that single frozen moment is exactly why we're talking about her name today. Because the 21-year-old who went down on center court that afternoon didn't just get back up. She turned a sporting nation's decades-long wait into a single unforgettable summer. And by the time you finish hearing how it all unfolded, you'll understand why an entire country of more than 100 million people stopped what they were doing to watch one young woman chase something none of her countrymen had ever touched before. Let's set the scene properly, because you need to feel the size of what she was walking into before you can appreciate what she pulled off. It's the third round of Wimbledon 2026, and across the net stands Iga Swiatek, the defending champion, a six-time major winner who 12 months earlier had steamrolled her way to a Wimbledon title without dropping a single game in the final, a feat so rare the sport had only seen it once before in the entire modern era. The player standing opposite her, seated 29th and largely unknown outside hardcore tennis circles, is Alexandra Eala, a Filipina who had already beaten Swiatek once, back at the Miami Open in 2025, in what was then the biggest scalp of her young career. This was the rubber match, except it was happening on grass, a surface neither woman had ever truly tested the other on, a surface where matches can turn on a single bad bounce or a single lost footing. The opening set alone stretched past 80 minutes, tight, brutal, full of momentum swings, and Swiatek came within a whisper of closing it out, building a lead in the tiebreak that had her 1 point away from taking full control. And then something in Eala refused to fold. She reeled off point after point to snatch the set away right at the doorstep of disaster, and the section of the crowd draped in Philippine flags, the ones who had queued for hours just to be inside that stadium, exploded like the tournament was already over. But it's what happened a little later in that same match that turned a good story into a legendary one. Chasing down a ball near the baseline, Eala lost her footing on the slick grass, and instead of simply falling, she stretched her entire body horizontal, fully airborne, and somehow still got her racket on the ball. Picture that for a second, a full-length dive, mid-air, and the shot still clears the net. It didn't even win the point outright, but it didn't need to, because that dive lit something in her and in the crowd that carried straight through to the finish. When the match ended, the scoreboard read a set apart from the way it started, and the woman who had won a Grand Slam final without losing a game 12 months earlier was packing her bags early. A Filipina had done what no player from her country, man or woman, had ever managed in the entire Open era, and she still had tennis left to play. Now rewind, because none of this happened by accident, and the road that led to that dive was long before it ever became glamorous. She grew up in Quezon City, raised by a mother who had once swum for the national team and a father who understood exactly what it costs a family to chase an athletic dream with no map to follow. There was no Filipino Grand Slam champion before her, no established pipeline, nothing to point to and say this is how it's done. She had to build the road while she was already walking down it. Just months before that Wimbledon run, she'd already shown flashes of what was coming. Back in February, at the Dubai Championships, she'd beaten her future fourth-round opponent Jasmine Paolini in a tight two-setter, though as any tennis fan knows, past results mean very little once the rematch actually begins. Before she ever got near Swiatek at Wimbledon, Eala had to survive 2 rounds that got buried in the noise of everything that followed. In the first round, she cruised past Renata Zarazua without much drama. In the second, against Maja Kwalinska, she dropped the first set completely and found herself staring down an early exit in just the second round of a major, only to storm back and win 12 of the final 18 games to survive. That's the pattern with her, over and over. Getting knocked down looks less like a crisis to her and more like a cue. So when she finally walked out to face the defending champion, she wasn't some feel-good underdog stumbling into a miracle. She was a competitor who had already proven twice in that same tournament that she simply does not stay down. And if you keep rewinding past Wimbledon entirely, you realize this wasn't some sudden explosion out of nowhere. It was a fuse that had been burning quietly for well over a year. Back in 2025 at the Miami Open, She became the first Filipina in history to reach a WTA 1000 semifinal, beating Swiatek along the way for the first time. That result alone should have been the story of an entire year for Philippine sport, and yet it turned out to be a preview of something bigger. She also knocked off former world number 2 Elena Rybakina in Berlin and took down Coco Gauff, one of the most feared competitors on tour, at Indian Wells. Any one of those wins would have defined a career for most players. For her, they were just quiet groundwork most casual fans hadn't noticed yet. In the weeks right before Wimbledon began, while the spotlight sat on bigger names, she was grinding through a title run at the Birmingham Open on grass and pushing to the semi-finals in Berlin, sharpening exactly the game that would soon make her a household name back home. That's the part of this story that rarely gets told with the weight it deserves. By the time she stepped onto center court to face the champion, she wasn't hoping to compete with the best in the world. She had already beaten several of them. She simply hadn't done it yet on a stage large enough to force the entire planet to pay attention. And once that win over Swiatek landed, the trajectory of the tournament and arguably of Philippine sport as a whole tilted permanently. No Filipino player, man or woman, had ever reached the second week of a Grand Slam singles draw in the sport's entire history. Not once. She had just done exactly that, on the lawns of the oldest, most storied tournament in tennis, and she had eclipsed marks set by Philippine tennis legends from the amateur era more than 70 years earlier. Now picture the fourth round. Center court again, this time with tennis royalty watching from the stands as a Filipina chased her first ever Grand Slam quarterfinal berth. Her opponent was Jasmine Paolini, the 13th seed, a former Wimbledon finalist who had already proven she could beat anyone on the biggest stages in the sport. Nobody expected this to be a coronation, and it wasn't. It was full-blooded tennis from the first point, momentum swinging wildly, neither woman willing to give away a single cheap point. Paolini took the opening set. Eala clawed back to level things in the second. For one electric stretch of that afternoon, an entire country allowed itself to believe the impossible might happen twice in the same tournament. It wasn't meant to be. Paolini closed out the decider to book her own return to a major quarterfinal, and Eala's historic run came to its final stop. But watch what happened in the moments right after match point, because this is the part nobody who saw it live has forgotten. She didn't storm off. She didn't hide her face. She stood at the baseline, found the section of the crowd that had been screaming her name since the very first ball of the tournament, and shaped her hands into a heart, holding the pose while the stadium roared back at her one more time. That single gesture told you everything about who she is, because losing a tennis match had never once cost her the moment. When the dust settled on the numbers, they were staggering. She became the first Filipino in the Open era to reach a Grand Slam fourth round, and the first ever to be seeded at any of the four majors. Along the way, she'd beaten 7 top 10 opponents across her career, 3 of them on grass in that single season alone. The run alone was worth roughly 240 ranking points and close to £300,000 in prize money, though as anyone close to her will tell you, the money and the points were never really the point of the story. The real story was what happened when she landed back on Philippine soil. Within days, word came out of the presidential palace itself that a homecoming reception was being arranged in her honor, celebrating her as the first Filipino ever to reach the second week of Wimbledon. On the night she walked into Malacanang flanked by her parents, she wasn't greeted by stiff protocol. She was greeted by a president who could barely contain himself, half joking that he'd basically invented the entire ceremony just for the chance to shake her hand. Then the tone shifted, and in front of the cameras broadcasting to the whole nation, he told her that she reminded Filipinos